Let's go ahead and take one more call before we wrap up the interview for the night and touch base with Faye in the UK. Faye, what can we do for you tonight?
Hi. Jack has made some really interesting points about why sex work should be decriminalized. I'm wondering what the arguments people make against decriminalization. I think it's illegal currently because it's based on old laws.
Yeah, so some of it is based on old laws, right? And that is something that we need to know. Sometimes it is just like society not moving forward and just kind of relying on the things that are already on the books. But I do think some of it is this kind of new wave of these kinds of like groups of, people who would call themselves feminists. I don't know if they're actually espousing feminist ideals, who push this for like this kind of savior narrative of rescuing people. And specifically, like we mentioned earlier, these kinds of like Christian fundamentalist rescue groups. But I think something we don't talk about in terms of their motivation behind changing the legal model from full criminalization to the Nordic model, where it's illegal to buy sex but not to sell, is that they have this kind of pipeline and this this public image issue where they can now pull people in through this. So you see a lot of these organizations talking about sex trafficking and saying like sex trafficking is awful, we're going to rescue people. And you see people from who are getting arrested for selling sex, who are then brought into these programs, which are explicitly religious programs that have like religious rules in them that they have to follow to be part of the program, so they don't end up with criminal records, or so they don't do prison time. But from a public perspective, it looks great for these Christian fundamentalists because they're like, look at how many people we're saving from sex trafficking. Aren't we doing great? We're making it illegal for people to buy sex, but we're protecting the people selling it. Isn't that an amazing thing that we've done here? So when you see changes in the law along that direction and you track back to where it's coming from, I do think some of it is a fundamentalist Christian image problem that they're trying to correct by grabbing a group of people that is highly stigmatized, the public generally sees as either victims or terrible people, and then kind of turns it around and says, like, they are fully victims. Like, we want to change their public image just a little bit so that we rely more on the victim narrative. And now we're rescuing them. So aren't we good people because we've done that? Is kind of what I see, at least when I track back where all of this is coming from. On the like front lines of random people arguing that, you might not necessarily see it. But when you start to see like the language they're using and you realize like, they're quoting Exodus Cry right now, and you go to Exodus Cry's website, it becomes very clear.
Yeah, and what what Jack is saying, and like I can draw a lot of analogies to the whole religious attitude of missionary work, right? Is we're gonna go and save these people from themselves, and we're gonna go to Kenya, or we're gonna go to China, and we're gonna save these people that don't need to be saved. It just gets back to that sort of infantilization that we were talking about earlier. What do you think about that, Faye?
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like a reasonable supposition. It's interesting that it seems mostly religious based and that there doesn't seem to be non-religious arguments against it. Are there any?
Well, because there just aren't any that are that good that I've ever heard.
Fair to say. I do think there is like a complication there as well with who's arguing what. So when people are arguing for like the Nordic model, those tend to be religious organizations arguing for it to be illegal to buy but not to sell. Whereas secular organizations, you might still hear arguing for things like legalization, where it's legal to both buy and sell sex, but you must be registered with the government, et cetera, because I think what's happening, I actually think directly what's happening is that they're imagining it in a similar way to how they want to deal with certain drugs. And they are treating it the same as they hear about weed. Their opinion on marijuana is that it should be like legal but regulated. And then they transfer that exact opinion across to sex workers, because often I see them arguing in the exact same way. And the immediate response that I have to that as their argument is just that people aren't things. And marijuana is an object and sex workers are people. So you can't regulate people like you regulate things.
Feels like a meaningful distinction here, right?
Yeah.
That's an excellent point.
Does that clear things up for you at all, Faye? Or was there anything else we might be able to touch on before we move on for the night?
I was just going to ask, are there any groups campaigning for decriminalization that you're aware of?
Yes, a ton of them. I would recommend Umbrella Lane, I would recommend the English Collective of Prostitutes, the ECP. I would recommend Swarm. I would recommend Scott Pep, which is specifically based in Scotland. I would recommend Swarm. I don't know if I listed them already. Then there's in the US, there's the SWOP, which is the Sex Workers Outreach Project. And they specifically will have different groups they don't just cover the US, but they are mostly US based. And you can find ones for each state. And you can also find some for like specific countries. All of those groups are campaigning for decriminalization. There's also Decrim Now, which is a group that you can look up. There's the Desiree Alliance. I'm probably missing a ton of different places, but these are all like sex worker organizations that specifically are fighting for full decriminalization.
And just my mandatory mention to everybody listening to this while jogging through the park, we will have a number of these different links and a lot of this information in the show notes to this episode. If you didn't catch it the first time round, we got you covered. But Faye, thank you so much for calling in.
Thank you.
Take care.
See ya.